Good evening. All right. I think I've read this story to you before. I can't remember it. It seemed like I had, but I couldn't find anything about that. But it's a story about a man who lived in California. He had a small apartment. This was back in 1995. He had a small apartment, but it was infested with cockroaches. I know usually, when I was younger, that would be no big deal. But now, if I see one cockroach in my home, ooh, the heebie-jeebies, right? Oh, well, this guy had a ton of them in this small apartment. How frustrating would that make you? To have to deal with that day in and day out. And he tried everything to try to get rid of these things, but he couldn't seem to get rid of these cockroaches. But he had heard about this new product. Now remember, this was 1995. He had heard about this new product called the Bug Bomb. It was an aerosol. You simply press a button there on the top, and the container, and for a couple of hours, you'd leave your home as it sprayed throughout your whole home. Well, he was desperate. He was frustrated. He was upset about this whole cockroach problem, so he wanted to be sure he got rid of them. He didn't just buy one. He didn't buy two. He didn't buy 5. He did not buy 10. 25 bug bombs. And he put them all throughout his house. He hit all the buttons, and he left. He failed to take into account how flammable bug poison was, and as the 25 cans released the spray in such a strong concentration there in his apartment, as it hit the pilot light on his gas stove, it ignited the fumes. The explosion resulted in blown doors and windows, set his whole apartment ablaze, and caused over $10,000 in damages to his apartment and the building as well. And as for the cockroaches, they could be seen crawling over the rubble. So didn't even kill them. Asked why he used so many cans, he said, I really wanted to kill them all, and I thought if I used a lot more, it would last longer. The label said on the cans to not use more than 2 at a time. If we are not careful, our anger can lead to some very explosive situations, right? And like the man in our story, many times we think that more will be better. The bigger our explosion, the more strongly we will make our point whenever we get upset or whenever we get angry. Our outbursts can be what we call overkill, like using a bazooka to kill a mosquito. Confucius said, don't use a cannon to kill a mosquito. And that reminds me of what took place in the life of David, who was the second king of Israel. During his time, David and his troops, they were on the run from King Saul. Maybe you remember this. He was on the run, he and his troops, and they didn't have many supplies, and they were running out. So they come across Nabal, who was a very wealthy man. That the 1 Samuel 25 lets us know he was rich, 3,000 sheep, about 1,000 goats, but that he was also a harsh man, and he was evil in his dealings. Now, Nabal was married to Abigail, who the Bible describes as an intelligent and beautiful woman. So David, being on the run, he starts to watch over Nabal's servants who are out there pasturing the flock and taking care of them, being kind of a wall for them to make sure they're taken care of. They didn't take anything from the servants. They didn't accept anything. And after a while of doing this, he sent some of his men, his troops, down to Nabal saying, hey, we've been watching over your servants. We've been watching over your flocks, keeping them safe. Could you please give us some food, some supplies? Nabal's response was sent back to David, and it was full of insults, is all he sent back to him after doing all that work. Now, David, we know his story very well. He's a very patient man. We see that with him in Saul. But for this guy, who he has been helping out for free of charge, to send back insults, how did David react? Every man strap on your sword. We're going to go visit Nabal. He's upset. He is angry. And if you know the rest of the story, As he's on his way, the servants tell Abigail, the wife, about what had happened, and she's a lot more humble. She gathers up more supplies than David asked for, goes out and meets David, and carrying the compensation, and she spoke with prophetic insight to David's conscience in the future. And David praised God for using Abigail to keep him from an angry outburst. We know how God dealt with Nabal, if you remember the story, and David ended up marrying Abigail. And as many others have observed over the years, anger is just one letter short from danger. Danger. It is an emotion, anger, that causes a lot of harm and gets a lot of people into trouble. But anger in and of itself is not bad, is it? This is a lesson I've preached often. You've probably heard it from me quite a bit. In fact, this first half of the lesson is going to be more of a refresher. The second half, I'm hoping I might be delving into something that might be new for us, that can really equip us not only to deal with anger within ourselves, but to see and recognize it in others, and where it's coming from, and how we might be able to help diffuse that anger. One of the ways we know that anger isn't always bad or wrong is because the Bible tells us God gets angry. Numbers chapter 14, verse 18, the Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness. Psalm chapter 7, verse 11, God is a righteous judge and a God who has indignation every day. Or as the King James puts it, God is angry with the wicked every day. Every single day. If I was upset or angry with my kids every day, they would not survive. Or I wouldn't survive, one of the two. But over and over in the Old Testament, we read God was angry with the people of Israel. The anger of the Lord burned against them. But God's anger wasn't confined to just the Old Testament. Mark chapter 3, verse 5, we read where Jesus was angry. You may remember this situation when he's in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And there was a man in there with a hand that wasn't working. It was a hurt hand, a paralyzed hand or something. And as he's walking into the synagogue, he sees him. And Jesus knows this man was planted there by the Pharisees. He's being used by them to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath day. And he gets upset. He has indignation. He gets angry. Mark 3:5 says, after looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. If God is perfect and is without sin, then we must understand that anger itself is not sinful. That's why Paul said, be angry and do not sin. It's not a sin. But what we do with that anger might become sinful. We're all going to get angry at times. And it's not the emotion of the anger that's the problem, but it's what we do with that anger. The problem comes when we act on those feelings in a sinful way. So let me remind us about something I've been saying throughout this whole series, that emotions are a gift from God. God has given us the capacity to feel in order that our lives might be enriched. So this emotion of anger is part of the emotional structure God built into us for our good. He made us with the capacity for anger, and we cannot and need not prevent those emotions from occurring in us. He created us with the ability to be angry for a reason. So as we've already pointed out in this series, the inability to feel pain, that's a dangerous condition. But also, the inability to feel anger would be dangerous for us as well. When violated by others, we ought to feel angry. When we see someone else being harmed or treated unjustly, we should feel anger. We need to become angry when we see corruption or injustice, when we see all kinds of crimes or murders or rapes, things like abortion or child abuse or alcoholism, and all these things ought to bring about our indignation. The devil, he is busy taking many people to hell with him, and that too ought to make us angry. But these feelings of anger need to be controlled. They need to be channeled into the right direction. The problem with anger comes when it's not dealt with in healthy ways. And so then this results in sinful words or sinful actions. We often picture a person who's angry, upset, they're losing control, they're throwing their limbs up, and they're bursting out, they're turning red and red-faced. And that's the way we sometimes imagine someone who's really angry. But tragically, sometimes anger, may throw in that way, but sometimes they can be overlooked. Anger can come about in other ways, subtle ways. The truth is that a person can be perpetually angry and have issues without being prone to outbursts of anger. And these individuals, they don't always know how to acknowledge or how to identify what they're feeling or how to express that feeling. So anger can remain bottled up inside. It can manifest itself in different, more subtle ways that are just as equally harmful or physically, emotionally, or relationally. But I want us to look at some of the signs that a person may have in their underlying anger issues. And I want us to bring this in so we can notice it in ourselves, but also so that we might be able to notice it in others as well. Now, it's true, when someone's in an angry state, it's very difficult to reason with them while they are in that angry state. But we'll be looking at that and dealing with that here in just a moment. But what are the signs that they are not using anger in healthy or helpful ways? Number one, a person may get aggressive, as we just mentioned. They get physical or emotionally aggressive when they're upset, and they may have anger issues. Now, this might involve, punching a wall, placing their hands upon someone who's angered them, or verbally abusing or screaming at that person, or taking measures to get even. A person may become passive aggressive. They might not show their anger in the form of a blow up or shouting, but they may become sarcastic or mean or have bitterness toward that other person. They might turn a cold shoulder or shut the other person out of their lives altogether. A person might stay angry for days. They might not be able to let go of that anger, to release it in some way, and so they dwell on it for days or for weeks, refusing to forgive that person who's wronged them or allow any kind of resolution to occur. A person might get angry quickly and often. They get angry at the drop of a hat. I've known many people that were like that, where you feel like you're walking on eggshells around the person. You got to be careful what you say or do around them, because you're not sure what might set them off. Or a person might blame others. They blame others for their anger and repeatedly tell them, if you would just stop your behavior in this way, then I would stop being so angry. But you're always acting this way, making me angry. It's all your fault. Do any of these signs of anger problems resonate with you? If so, you are not alone. Embracing and employing anger in healthy ways is something all of us must learn and deal with. And so when we find ourselves expressing anger, how do we embrace it? How do we employ it properly? And so I want to suggest a few things. And again, as I've mentioned in the past, I'm no counselor. I had to look these things up from much smarter, intelligent people. But the things I put in this list are things that I believe are true and I find in the Word of God. And the first one is that we need to recognize the anger. On the dashboard of your emotions, if that red light of anger comes on, we need to recognize what it is. When the angry feelings arise, we need to call them what they are. I'm angry. I'm getting upset. We need to be in touch with our feelings. Yeah, that phrase, be in touch with your feelings. Whenever I hear that, I just I almost turn the person off when I hear it. That's something I'm a man. I don't come in touch with my feelings. I take ownership. So if that's the word you want to hear, take ownership of your feelings. Take responsibility of them. Or if you want, be in touch with your feelings. Whatever works. Use that. It will do us no good to deny, to ignore, or to suppress the anger. It does no good. When we bury our anger, you're burying it alive. Eventually, it's going to come back up out of that grave far worse than when it went in. It's not going to work. I've been in a meeting. This was not here. This was in another place. It was a men's meeting, and this one guy was getting upset and angry. I don't even remember what it was about, but I can vividly see him in my mind's eye pounding on those plastic tables. That's what we have in there. Pounding on it. That's loud. Yelling at the top of his lungs and looking around, and you could see the anger in him. He was so upset. When it was brought to his attention that he was angry, and they were asking why he got so upset about that, he said, "What do you mean? I was not angry." Yeah, he was. It will be impossible to deal appropriately with your anger if you deny its existence. So we need to recognize it. Number 2, we need to restrain it. I want to give you a couple of Proverbs. Proverbs 29:22 tells us, "An angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression." Or as the NIV says, commits many sins. Proverbs 29:11, "A fool always loses his temper, but a wise man holds it back." Proverbs 16:32, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." Man, what a contrast. These scriptures don't mean that the wise men bury their anger and don't deal with it, but it does mean that the wise control their anger, and they control how they employ that anger. And here in a little bit, as we get closer to the end, I'm going to show you an example from the Bible that does that. When we restrain our anger, we keep it under control, don't we? We provide limits for it. But I can't control my anger. Have you ever heard someone say, "I can't control it"? It just, sometimes it pops out, "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to control it." That is not true. Have you ever been upset or angry, and you're having a heated discussion with a brother or maybe a sister or maybe your wife or a husband or a friend or your boss, and then the phone rings, and you're, "Hello? Oh, hi." Yes. "Oh, I'm just a little out of breath. I was running." Yes. Have you ever done that? Or seen others do that? Or maybe you're in a heated argument in the car, and you're upset. And as soon as you walk through the doors of the church building, right as rain. And sometimes we think we shouldn't be that way. We should be the people who we really are. That's actually fine, because that's proving you can control your anger. You can control it. I've known people who had anger problems. They would discuss it, but they never lost their job. That tells me they can control their anger in front of their boss. You can control it. It is possible. So to say that we can't control our anger is not true. We can. And the problem is that we have gotten into the habit of losing control of our anger in certain settings with certain people, like our spouse, like our kids, or whomever it might be. So in reality, it's not that we can't control it, it's that we won't, or that we don't. Knowing how dangerous, knowing how destructive unrestrained anger can be, that's an important step, early step in restraining anger and keeping it under control. Number 3, we need to reevaluate the anger. I want to use the passage from James 1:19 and 20. Now, James is talking about something different, but I do want to use it anyway. He says there, "This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." He's talking about our approach to the Word of God there in that passage. But here, I want us to think about it as far as when we feel anger rising up inside of us, that's an invitation to investigate our hearts. We need to be taking a look at that. Anger is usually not the real problem. It is just a reaction to the problem. Take, for example, Cain. He was angry, but underneath that anger was resentment that his brother's offering was more acceptable to God than his. King Saul, was angry with David. He tried to kill him. But underneath that anger was insecurity that his position was being threatened. The prodigal son story, the older brother became angry. But underneath that anger again was the perceived unfairness of his father and resentment toward his brother. The critics of Jesus, they were often angry with Jesus, but underneath their anger was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of fear, and a lot of pride. Emotionally healthy people strive towards self-awareness, and they look for the true source of the anger when they feel it rising up in them. Are they angry someone cut them off in traffic, Chris? Or is it anger from feeling disrespected? Are they angry their spouses were late for dinner, or that it made them feel unimportant? Emotionally healthy people explore those feelings to see if they're misplacing the blame, or if they're harboring an untrue belief about themselves or about others. So if we find ourselves in a constant state of rage and anger, or we're always blowing up and losing control, then that means there's something else going on inside. It's not the anger. There's something going on underneath that. Finding that source, the source of our anger, will help us to know how to embrace and how to employ the anger. Aristotle said, anyone can become angry, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. He's right. Fourth and finally, once we recognize our anger, restrain it, and reevaluate it, then we need to resolve and release it. Colossians 3:8 says, but now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. When we embrace and we employ the anger God's way, we'll feel it, we'll understand it, and then we find a good use for it to bring about the needed changes, whether it's in us or in the situation, but whatever it might be, so that no one is harmed, and then it is released. And once the anger has been used in a proper way, we get rid of it from our body. Take it out of our hearts, out of our minds. But if we allow it to hang around, it becomes a tool for the devil. That passage we know well from Ephesians 4:26, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. So notice, Paul does not give the devil credit for the anger or for making us angry. But he says if we let anger hang around, then that's going to give the devil a foothold in us. And he will take advantage of that. So now I want you to turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5, excuse me. Nehemiah had a fine position in the court of King Artaxerxes, but he left that position to go to Jerusalem to help rebuild the wall. Unfortunately, some of the Jews who had also returned to Jerusalem had been exploiting their own countrymen by taking their fields, taking their daughters and other things from those who owed them money. The Bible tells us when Nehemiah discovered this in Nehemiah 5, verse 6, then I was very angry when I had heard their outcry and these words. And this is certainly something that should make anybody angry when they discover it. But notice Nehemiah's first step. He recognized he was angry. And then he immediately restrained that anger. He didn't blow up about it. He didn't run ahead and try to do something immediately. It says, the Bible tells us in verse 7, I consulted with myself, or the New King James, after serious thought. After serious thought. He restrained the anger while he reevaluated what is causing the anger and what to do about it. He didn't fly out the handle. He stopped to think. But then once he had those thoughts and those emotions in order, he recognized that something needed to be done about this particular situation. That he couldn't just stand idly by while widows and children were being enslaved and their property seized, all because by mortgage holders. So he proceeded to resolve and release the anger. At the earliest opportunity, he confronted the leadership. The Bible tells us in verses 7 through 11, Nehemiah 5, I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and the rulers and said to them, you are exacting usury each from his brother. Therefore I held a great assembly against them. I said to them, we, according to our ability, have redeemed our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Now would you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us? Then they were silent and could not find a word to say. Again I said, the thing which you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? And likewise, I, my brothers, and my servants are lending them money and grain. Please let us leave off this usury. Please give back to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, their houses, also the 100th part of the money and of the grain, the new wine, and the oil that you are exacting from them. And how did these folks respond? Verse 12, then they said, we will give it back and will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say. Now, we should not expect that every time we embrace and employ our anger in the most appropriate ways, that the resolution will be as good and as neat as we see here in Nehemiah 5. But I do guarantee that the outcome will most often be better than if we simply explode onto the scene. With God's help, we can employ or embrace and employ our anger in ways that blesses everyone. With God's help, we can recognize our anger, we can restrain it, we can reevaluate it, we can resolve and release it. And in this way, anger can be a window into our hearts, leading to a more positive result, and not a door for the devil to control or destroy us. God gave us the emotion of anger for a reason. Let us not allow the devil to use it for our destruction. And being armed with these thoughts and with these ideas, especially Nehemiah chapter 5, I really like that passage and how that's plays out. You can see those things all fall in line there. And like I said, I don't have the ability to put all those kinds of things together. I stand on the shoulders of other great men, but it is something that we can use not only for ourselves, but in the help of others as well when we recognize these things in them. If we can get a grasp on this, properly use our anger in positive ways, we can be not only a light to them so they can see an example, but perhaps we can even counsel them in moving them in the right direction on how to deal with them. As we have noted, every night we have been working through this series, people in this world do not know how to deal with their emotions. We looked at several. Each one of them, we could easily look out there in the world and see people struggle with it. Do people struggle with anger? People are shooting each other when they cut each other off on the road. I see people walking down the street and they just randomly knock someone in the head because they're angry. They don't know how to deal with it. How are they ever going to learn unless someone can show them the way? And that is you and me. It starts with us. That is what it means to be light and salt to this world. God is angry with the wicked every day. Let's not add to that wickedness. We need to be adding to the righteousness. Salt not only makes things taste better, but it's also a preservative. And I think as long as there are Christians practicing Christianity in this world, God is going to leave the world. But if it's all wicked constantly, remember Genesis chapter 6, when God looked upon the world and every thought and intention of man was evil, so God's going to destroy it. If we want to give people an opportunity to make the right choice, It needs to start with us being light. And that's the lesson I want to leave with us this week. I've been doing each Sunday night as we go over these emotions. But this week, focus on the anger. Recognize it. Evaluate it. Take a look at that situation and then resolve it. And use the help of God. Take a look at Nehemiah 5. Remember Ephesians and the other passages we looked at this evening. They will help you along the way. And use your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ if you need that. And help those who are in dire need of that help as well as we struggle with this emotion. Because it is given to us as a gift, and we need to employ it in a proper way. So as we close this out, before the invitation song, we want to open that up to anyone who might have need of the prayers of the congregation.